Hello and good evening for those in the UK. Those in America, maybe good afternoon or good morning. Um, Welcome to Ray4Truth Ministries. Now, this is a little bit of a special that I'm going to put together based on um, how many of you have been putting forward all sorts of comments in previous streams, especially over the case for God, um, and looking at atheism versus theism, um, looking at morality, and all those things. Beginning or source of the universe, how did the universe came about. I literally had probably over between 100 and 200 comments over various different streams. So I thought it deserved a response. Now, I have provided every single comment, apart from maybe the latest one or two or whatever. I have responded specifically on each comment, question, or whatever you. But I thought it still needed a proper session on explaining these things. Now, what might surprise you, and I need to make this very, very clear as a genuine Christian, the Christian position is this: we believe there is a God based on a number of factors. Obviously, these are evidence-based. They're not just based on a whim or based on some just thought or dream or whatever you want to call it. This is based on real life. And what we are saying is we're not claiming that we have absolute proof that our belief is true, that there is a God, and it's what we see as the Christian God as the only true God. That's not what we're claiming. So if you have Christians that do claim that, they're not being very precise. Now, there may be reasons why. Sometimes it could be just as a figure of speech where people say, well, I have the absolute truth and it's definitely true and I know 100% and so on. But that's not the reality of this. It's not even in Scripture. The Scripture talks about it's a faith-based belief, meaning that it's based on evidence that convinces us more than not, and that the level of convincement, shall we say, level of evidence convinces us that it is worth believing in and pursuing, because it is a big leap, if you like, in one's life to believe in God and then adjust one's life to that belief. It is a big, huge transformation required. It requires, generally speaking, a higher level of morality because, and we'll go through that in a minute, even though some of the comments say otherwise, is that we believe that God's morality is of a very high standard, shall we say. Just for argument's sake, let's just say it's a very high standard, and that usually is higher than the average person. And there are very good reasons for that, of course. The most important one, of course, is if there is no God, why or would you care to be that concerned about how good your moral standard is, as long as you find a value or benefit from it? And that's another thing we're going to look into to see why. You can see from an atheist point of view, there are all sorts of challenges to why you believe what you believe and your moral compass, if you like, and how you treat people, whatever you is the way you do. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying all atheists are of a poor standard. I have many atheist friends. I've had many atheist friends all my life, and a number of them, have a very good moral life, and they have lived to very high standards. But it's not about that. It's about, where does this evidence take us when we look at the comparison which is ultimately the point of this, is when we look at the theist position in terms of the evidence, or shall we say the case for theism versus the case for atheism. Which one is the more convincing? Now, when I look at a lot of the comments, what I do see is from an atheist position that a lot of the individuals that were commented were making very strong points, getting some of them quite emotional and a little bit maybe excessive with some of the words, choice words being used, which weren't very respectful, to be honest with one or two of them, but that's no surprise. It's quite common that we have people that do express themselves that way. But the point being is, though, there was a lot of strong, passionate views that they were right, and atheism is the truth, as in they're more convinced. And interestingly, we want to look at what is the evidence for that. Now, I would agree that if we're saying and we believe there is a God, the burden is on us to provide the evidence, and I would agree that is fair enough. But I would also suggest that atheism, if that is true, the burden is on the atheist to prove that there is no God, that the state of the beginning of the universe came about without some kind of intelligent, super powerful source. Because that is the atheist position. And there are obviously variations on theories to how the universe began. That it's by no means foolproof. There's nothing, even from an atheist position, of course, or a scientific position outside of God, that has the absolute 100% answer to how the universe started. So, how do we resolve this, shall we say, dilemma? What is ultimately true? I'm saying straight out, we cannot provide absolute evidence that is clear cut one way or the other, whether it's theism or atheism. But what I think I can do, and I think many Christians can do, is put a very good case. And one of the things I've noticed in a lot of the comments is the complete misunderstanding of the Christian position. And I will grant a lot of atheists, I think one of the main reasons for this is they maybe speak to various different Christians, or maybe read up certain documents and maybe certain books of certain Christians have written, and you will get some very interesting answers, and they're definitely not consistent. I will admit, not all Christians have the same view, even on some of these basic foundational things. There are some differences of view, but our faith, just so it's clear, is not based on individual views. Our faith is based on God's word. However, we don't eliminate Christians' views, because part of what we believe in God's word is there are some supernatural events. One to mention straight off the bat is in the Bible, which has been dated as certain parchments and manuscripts have confirmed, was written 300-400 years before the crucifixion of Christ, or before certain other events. Yet we see archaeology and history and everything else that goes with it proved that those events did actually take place so many years later, showing that there was a supernatural prophecy being put forward. So that is, again, just part of the case. It doesn't mean absolute proof, because you could argue that maybe they were speculating and got lucky and it did happen to be, or based on whatever reason. But the only way you could make a case for God or not is you have to put all the evidence together. It is the compilation of all the... It's a bit like if somebody committed a very serious crime and was put in front of the judge. they would have to look at not just one single thing, but have to look collectively in all the evidence that's put forward to make a judgment. Was the person guilty or not? Well, that's kind of what I'm doing. I think this is what you need to do, is to look at all the evidence, pros and cons from both sides, to see whether what stacks up as the most convincing. I'm more convinced that God is real, which is why I'm a Christian. Not because of some very weak view or whatever that some atheist said in the comments, like I'm basing it on some sort of whim or whatever words they used. No, it's based on very, very strong evidence. And that's what I'm going to basically put forward in this stream tonight. Also, I want to cover, as I said, I want to cover off in a much better way, as I said I would do. So I am holding to my promise. I know I forgot what the viewer name was at the time, but he was making all sorts of accusations that because I didn't respond this way and because I didn't do this, because I didn't do this, therefore I'm a dishonest, I'm not whatever. You know, you can make all these claims all day long if you like. You're just making claims based on very little information. I have no obligation to reply to any comment if I so wish. So there is no obligation which proves one way or another my position or whether or not what is the reason behind it. It's just that's my choice. You cannot for certain know why. But I'm being as honourable as I can by at least trying to respond where I can. And as I said, up until about a week ago, roughly, I had responded to every single comment. And as I said, they were over 100. There were a lot. And some of them, thank you, Sandra, if I got the name right. Yes, Sandra Jackson. You've been very good. I know we don't agree. That's fine. But you've been very, very good at putting forward a very good argument. You've taken the time out to put a sensible reply, providing a good level of supporting detail to put your case. What I did want to do, maybe I can start with quickly going through some of these points. We'll probably touch on it a bit more later as well. I'm also going to cover this whole thing about evil in the Bible, what we call these challenging verses. And there are quite a few of them. And I would agree, some of these verses, when I read them, I do find hard to comprehend. What is God doing in these verses? Now, I think one of the main things I want to really be clear is, I can't remember where the verse is. I know it's Exodus, from memory, it's either the Exodus 36, I think it is. I can double check anyway. I'll put it in the notes, in the description at some point when I've got it, if I don't come across it later. I think I did have it written down somewhere, so we'll come to the exact verse in a minute, where God says that he is loving and gracious. So he does tell us precisely what his moral standard is. However, I do appreciate God saying one thing versus what we see in terms of his actions in certain situations may appear to be contradictory, where it appears that he is acting in, shall we say, an evil way or heinous way or whatever. And I would accept the atheist position on the very quick reading, shall we say, of the verse. That's how it appears. And it only takes where you need to just look into these verses more closely, understand the context, which I will accept is not easy. It would need take a fair bit of study to go in and get a better understanding, a full picture. Now, one of the ways to do that, of course, is I've got an example here of Deuteronomy 20, so we may be going to that one first, which is this command of total destruction. What was going on there? We need to understand a bit of the background, what was happening prior to that. What was the reason why God commanded what he commanded? And also, we need to understand in what sense did he mean. It's not always literally. You know, we have these sort of exaggerated sort of rhetoric where we're just saying, "I'll just kill them all off." We don't literally mean kill them all off. It's just a manner of just, a kind of blanket statement to kind of make a real damage to that number of people or whatever, to really make an effect. But that doesn't mean, like I know, for example, when it says about killing off the Canaanites, I think it was on one of the verses, it kind of suggested to kill every single one. But we do know that wasn't the case. That wasn't really what was meant, because we do know, of course, Canaanites weren't wiped out. They still existed, and they were still around afterwards. So it wasn't like a true full annihilation as the verse suggested. But there is context to this. And the main context I would say, before we start going into the verses, is what we would call God's judgment. Now, this is very, very important, because what God has to do is, one, he has to be just, and two, he has to deal with what we call very serious crimes. Some of these groups, like the Canaanites and what have you, were going directly against God in terms of false worship, putting babies as sacrifices, burning babies as sacrifices, but deliberately going against God, knowing that God is real because they've had a direct experience with God, but yet they're idolizing false gods that they're making up, going completely against God. And God is warning them, if you continue to do this, I will cast judgment on you. But this was not a case of like, he sees this and just responds. He gave them warning after warning after warning. And in some cases, it was hundreds of years, warning them consistently that if you do not, at the end of the day, change your ways and you continue to go against me, my final judgment will happen. So that's another bit part of the context you need to take into account. So what I will do is I will just quickly go through some of these comments, just as a better response, because I'm finding it hard to, I'm sure you'd agree, it's not easy to keep having to type answers and explanations to things. And I want to just qualify some points so that we're really not, hopefully for those who are listening, and hopefully some atheists are watching the stream, and you're more than welcome. I invite any atheist to come along. I'm going to copy the link into the chat if I can do that, so that we've got it there. And if at any point, let's see if I can pin that as well. So just in case the comments start flooding in, that stays at the top. If at the right time I can find a gap where we can have somebody on, we will definitely have you on if you want to come on the live chat and talk to me directly. More than happy to do that. I've got nothing to hide. My only request is, and it will be based on how you behave. I will not have foul language. I certainly won't have a case where you're just throwing ad hominems in my direction and being insulting and all that and disrespectful. The moment that is clearly observed, I will drop you. That's my only condition. But as long as you're reasonable, fair, and respectful, I will do the same back to you, of course. And I'll be more than happy to continue the conversation. Like I said, this is really not about, this may sound a bit strange from some atheist view, thinking, I'm not saying that I'm here to prove anything. I really am not. All I'm really wanting to do is to say that God is a better case than not. And I think there's good evidence to believe there is a God than not. And of course, what I'm saying there is, like I said at the very beginning, we don't have absolute definite proof. You know what? There's whatever anybody says, nothing in this world is absolute proof. I may not even be here. This may be just some dream somebody's put together that I've just part of this dream, making it feel like it's real, but I may not even be real for all I know. I feel real, but who's to say for certain? Who's to say anything for certain? Who's to say that this thing in front of me is a microphone? It's only based on information that we have that we deduce or draw that conclusion. And that's really the point. And when you look at, I know a lot of atheists say, well, this is definitely because science says so. Well, that's a pile of nonsense, because science themselves continually change their position. And that's fair enough, because science is again based on theories. And like any science, it's also based on a whole bundle of presuppositions, of which quite a few cannot be proven or not. It's just assumed, based on that's the most likely basis or foundation to base your theory on. So no genuine scientist is going to say, yeah, I know the absolute answer. And certainly when it comes to the beginning of the universe, they are a long way. Nobody has got anywhere near fully understanding the beginning. So there are many, many theories out there to how the universe began. So that's what we're going to start with. So one of the things that was coming up a lot was this whole thing about the origin of the universe, that from an atheist position, that it was like some kind of energy. We're not saying there was nothing. We're saying there was something. It's just energy. Okay, I can accept that as a reasonable explanation. And then, of course, we do know that energy can transition into materiality, in some sort of material existence. If you like, a kind of conversion of energy. So it's just changing its state, if you like. That I would say is a very plausible option. And I actually so far go along with that. So I'm in agreement with an atheist. If it's Sandra, I don't know who it was. There's quite a few people coming up with all sorts of things. I would agree with that. I think that's a sensible case to explain the source of the universe, because as we're going to see when I go into more detail, there really is a problem in trying to piece together all the facts. The evidence is all over the place. That there's so many different things you can look at that can be part of evidence you could put in front of the judge, if you like. So it gets very complicated, and there is no one single scientist, as we know, that has all the answers, and not all scientists in that field all agree with each other. I know I'm stating the absolute obvious here, and I feel I need to. Because if people are going to start disputing these things I'm saying now, then they really aren't being reasonable. And they're also being dishonest. Because there is absolutely no question, and I could list them if you wanted to, if you just want to be lazy and not bother yourselves. There are many, many different theories out there, and they're not all in agreement. And that's absolutely fine. All of them have done different researches. They have different skills and, what have you. And they've had different, shall we say, perceptions on what they think is factual, what's not. And they've gone down a certain path and investigated down that particular route to come to a particular theory. And that's not stopped another scientist also going down another route, coming up with their theory. There's the one about antimatter, matter coming together, cancels themselves out. That's not really nothing, but in a perception, it's nothing. But of course, there was matter there, so surely there was still something from the result. The only problem, of course, with that is it's got no way of testing that to see if there is something left over. And this is part of a theory that's ongoing at the moment. But that's really not getting us anywhere. What really is important is simply there must have been something at the very beginning. The reason why we say this is if what started the universe had a beginning, that itself then would say, well, where did the source of that come from to begin? So that will need a start, that will need a cause, that will need something to bring it into reality. So that doesn't really solve anything, just saying that something has a beginning. But what we're saying is we can't say that the universe always existed, because that means it would have existed for eternity. It means it never had a beginning. But that then still begs the question, how do you explain that? What we have to then do is look at the evidence we have. Based on the material world that we have, the universe that we know it, the evidence is showing that it has a beginning. Now, it doesn't matter whether you believe that or not. It makes sense that there's a lot of good case that it makes sense that it does have a beginning. But, and this is the important bit, whatever that beginning was, whether it was energy, okay, and I'm happy to accept energy, what I would say is, unless you go down the road, as I said before, infinite regression, the very, very beginning of what we know as a beginning must have always existed. It must have been outside of time and space, because time and space obviously had a beginning. So whatever this was, if you want to call it energy, always existed. It just has to. Otherwise, as I said, infinite regression, you're still going to get back to the problem of solving, well, where did that come from? And so on and so on and so on. Now, we want to take that one step further. So if you are watching Sandra, because I know you definitely mentioned something about energy, is it more likely that this energy was unintelligent, not that powerful, and not personal in terms of making a very specific choice to, shall we say, utilize its energy in such a way that it produced the universe as we know it? My point is, and this is definitely a case for many people, and certainly even many scientists, or even coming to the conclusion, theists or atheists or whatever, that what we see in the universe, knowing how incredibly fine-tuned it is, knowing how incredibly complex it is, and how difficult it would be to put together a plan or a purpose to create this universe from whatever source of energy and successfully do it to this level. My point is the logic simply points to an intelligent source than not. I'm not saying I've got the evidence to prove it. I'm saying the case is it's more likely the judge is going to be looking at this and saying, I would say that that energy is more likely to be intelligent than non-intelligent based on what we do know of the universe. The universe is pointing to an incredible, sophisticated being. And many atheist scientists as well, not all, of course, but many are coming to the conclusion that there's some intelligence behind all this. That's what we're seeing. The more we investigate, the more we research scientifically, the more we're seeing how incredibly complex the universe is, even to the single cell, which was another point that was raised about the single cell. What we do know is in that single cell, which is absolutely proven scientifically, so atheists, you're pretty strong at agreeing with science, you can't deny from the science that a single cell contains very sophisticated, what I'm going to call code. You can call it whatever you like, but it's the DNA of a cell is incredibly complex. A single cell, and every cell, single cell, has this complex DNA code in it. Again, why would that not point to intelligence as its source? Then not. This is where it gets silly. If we just have energy with no intelligence and no real superpower in it, more importantly, the ability to consider creating a universe in a very precise way, how is that realistic if it's not intelligent and doesn't have the right qualities to be able to build it? What we see in the world is everything super complex. Certainly man with its ability can't really build anything unless it uses its intelligence. And with the fact we do have this intelligence, suggesting if we have all this intelligence, why isn't the big source of this not also with intelligence? And it's probably going to be more intelligent than us because we can't create the world. We can't create a planet. We can't create life or whatever. We're not even anywhere near being able to do that. Even if you throw another billion years on it, it just shows you the level of intelligence that must exist or had exist back at the very beginning. That to me is a far more likely case. And I'm just saying it's more likely. I'm just putting the case. I'm not saying it's 100% proven. So you atheists don't start shouting at me with your comments, well, you got no absolute proof. I'm not saying I have got absolute proof. Neither of you. But my point is, what's the better explanation? Intelligence or non-intelligence? I'll leave that for you, the audience, to draw your own conclusion. I hope that's clear. I hope that's as simple as I could possibly make it. I think I need to sometimes when I see some of the comments. I ain't going to read them out. I don't want to embarrass people. Some of them were really quite ridiculous. But that's not part of this stream. The point of the stream is to search for truth. So let's be good about that. And as I say, one of the questions was about drawing your conclusion there is a God. So where do roughly Christians come to the conclusion there is a God? So there are a number of factors, and I say it is the collection of all the factors as a whole is I think we may have had a problem with the mic. Hopefully it's working now. So what is the case we've got? So first of all is the universe around us, and that's what I've already started to allude to, is we have evidence simply that the universe is incredibly complex. Everything we know about the world is very, very complex. It points to an intelligent design, an intelligent source at least. We would also say that it points to something that has a lot of energy. Well, I'm happy to accept this energy thing because don't forget, God says in the Bible it's a spirit, which is like a form of energy, if you like. Well, let's not go into the silly and say, well, what's a spirit? What's energy? Well, we don't really know. We haven't got evidence precisely to explain what spirit is or what energy is. We just know by our methods that it must exist. But we can't really truly explain it. But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist just because we can't explain it. Because we could see the results of what, for example, maybe you get up in the morning and you see your, like I have in my case, half my garage got smashed and blown. The roofing came off. We would definitely say that some sort of energy, which could be like a storm or whatever, caused that to happen. And we heard all the noise in the night, all the noise from the wind. We could be quite confident to say some sort of energy did that, but we can't say exactly what that energy is in absolute terms. But we can get a good idea of all the attributes of what that energy is, and that's what we call a storm. If you see where I'm going with this, yeah? So it doesn't matter if we can't be absolute, as long as we've got enough evidence to be confident that a storm was what happened. We're happy to put our faith and trust that it was a storm rather than a big grey elephant coming along and walking into my garage from wherever. Maybe he escaped from the zoo. Of course, it's a possibility. But we got to go with what's most likely. The same in a jury. We don't look at evidence that's so unlikely to prove this guy killed this person. We look at the evidence that's most likely to see whether it's convincing enough to sentence him, to draw the conclusion he was guilty. And we do that on the basis of that evidence, not on absolute proof. Most cases, it's not absolute proof. Even if you see someone shoot somebody, doesn't absolutely prove 100% that they killed that person. You may say, well, that's absolute proof. No. It's a very high percentage. It could be when he prigged the gun and the gun went off. It may have had fake bullets in there, not real bullets. 2, it may have missed, but somebody else was also shooting, and it was him who actually shot the person. You see where I'm going with this? I mean, they're all less likely, which is why we're never saying 100%. What we go with what is the best evidence. And I'm going to keep re-emphasizing it. So you people in the comments, you're going to get the point, hopefully, at some point, that it is down to based evidence, not absolute proof. And I'm never, ever claiming absolute proof. Just that I think theism is the better case than atheism. This is an interesting comment. Science produces reliable, consistent results. Yes, to a large extent they do. But it doesn't have the answer to all things. It's just one method. You cannot go into a science lab and prove your wife loves you. I don't think you need to think too hard with that one. There are certain things that science simply is unable to prove because it's outside the realms of science. Science is one form of method, a methodology, if you like, but it's not the only method. Observation is also another method. Just observing how your wife treats you gives you a very good case that your wife loves you, but it's not absolute. Your wife could be deceiving you all this time, pretending to love you, but was never being genuine. You could never know for certain. But there again, my point is I'm going to keep re-emphasizing this, so don't put it in the comments. No absolute proof. It's the best case that if my wife is continually expressing love to me that convinces me she loves me, that's good enough for me. It should be good enough for you. Okay? So, science is great, doesn't have answers to everything. It certainly doesn't have the answers for the beginning of the universe. And it certainly doesn't have an answer to miracles, supernatural events. I'll give you an example. I may have already mentioned this, so apologies if they heard this already. I was prayed on. We know there's no way science can prove that a prayer can solve or heal somebody, but I was healed on the spot. And all they do is uttering words. The prayer is just saying, God, please, in the name of Jesus, heal this man. I was healed. So I don't care what you say. That's my personal testimony. And you could make all sorts of stories, well, this or that. Oh, no, I had absolute clear evidence for me that something supernatural happened because I know somebody just calling out as a prayer cannot heal somebody just from that basis unless something supernatural out of the ordinary took place. That's a bit that cannot be explained by science. That doesn't mean it's definitely God either. I'm not saying it's definitely not God. I never will do. But I'm convinced, based on my faith and all the other collection of evidence which we're going through, I would say that is why I believe it is from God. The collective evidence. Another subject which we won't touch straight away because I've got this well covered for a little bit later on is the proof of objective morality. Now, this to me is quite a good argument, and I can see why atheists believe what they believe. And I actually respect to some degree why they think objective morality is something that just developed through some kind of evolutionary process. On the surface, it sounds feasible. And I would say it's a reasonably good case to put forward. This is where you need to get into the detail. And that's where I think we will look at that later. I've already covered it a bit already, and I'm happy to cover it even more because I think it's a very, very important topic and argument to evaluate. Is there such a thing as objective morality? Now, one of the persons in the comments says there is no such thing. Of course, that's a different atheist position to another atheist in the comments who did believe it, except he said it was something that evolved over time. So not all you atheists are in agreement, by the way, but I'm sure you know that already, I hope. So you're saying there is no objective morality. There's one major flaw with that. How would you even know? When you look at anything in terms of why you say that's right or that's wrong, based on what standard? If there's no standard to base it on, you can't really say. It's just a subjective view, a subjective opinion of what is right or wrong. But that would, if you think about it, take it one extra step, which is what we're going to do, what sort of issues would that bring about? If there's no clear cut of what's right and what's wrong, because there is no standard. If there's no standard, that's what we were calling objectively, is that standard, that moral objective morality is that ultimate standard that right or wrong is judged by. Because if we do not have that, then we have no real basis, because without that, it's an opinion, and boy, do we have an opinion. There is a plethora of different views of what is good and what is evil in terms of specifics of acting this way or acting that way. And we have seen that change over time. And we're going to go into the detail of that, so I won't say too much more, because that's when it really is going to start to show that without objective morality, again, we get the issue of how do we even know what is right or wrong in the first place. It's a bit like whatever the beginning was must have always existed, because otherwise we have infinite regression. In the same way, the same principle, if we don't have objective morality, then we can never know for sure what is right or wrong, for the reasons I already mentioned. So but anyway, that's just the basics of it. So that's my basic reply, to say there's no objective morality. And I don't know who said that, not that I'm going to name names, but anyway, that's my response to that. And I will unpack that a lot more, and happy to do so. Okay, I'm just rechecking no one's wanting to join yet, so that's fine. I'm not surprised that many atheists don't want to join. They say a lot in the comments, but I did suggest them they're more than welcome to jump on. But again, surprise, surprise, still nobody. But hopefully one day somebody will join. Why are the morals from God objective? Now, this to me is another daft question. We believe that God is the source of the creation of all things. So surely he will be the one, if he created us, will be the one that would have the authority and the source, be the source of how we're created and why we're created the way we are, which then suggests that he would be the one that will be the source of morality. The reason being is we have free will. When we have the ability to choose and make decisions, we ourselves can't be the source, because it's subjective between us. No one person. 1 second. No one person has got a handle on absolutely what is right or wrong, and we can't rely on man. So it would suggest it's got to be something that's transcendent of humans. And why can't it be the source of all things? And if God is the source of all things, it makes sense that he should be the source of the ultimate authority on morals. Just logically fits. And what we believe, of course, is if we believe that God that we believe is the evidence of a God, is the God of the Bible, which is, of course, that's another step forward in evidence. In that Bible, we do see evidence of how God is laying out his moral standards. We have the Ten Commandments, of course. We also have how Jesus fulfilled the laws to fulfill basically those principles, and they became what Christ then defined more accurately in terms of what we call the fruits of the Spirit: love, peace, mildness, self-control, and so on, showing you these are really what we call the qualities of God, which was, of course, it also mentioned in the Old Testament as well. So it's not just exclusive to the New Testament. It is in the Old Testament as well, all these qualities, but they're just not all in one place. They're kind of in different places they are mentioned, but showing you how God is revealing himself over time with those qualities. But of course, we do have the issue with some of the bad verses, so we're going to cover that as well. So that's the kind of reason why we do believe that God should be the one that is the source of those morals, and the Bible being for us the evidence of where we see that. Now, this is a bit interesting. Evil, something what we call teleological evil. and that it was meant to happen. Now, I will say this. We don't really understand fully what really is evil, why it's around, why even does it exist. All we know is this, is it's, if you like, evil is the act that goes against what is good. And if we have free will, which of course we do, I don't think anyone would argue that point, it makes us to have a choice that if we choose, decide to do something that we think is good, but it's actually not, whatever reason, then we are performing an act of evil. It's the opposite of what is good. It's, I know some of it's subjective, of course, but we're saying ultimately it still goes back to those ultimate morals, which is the standard that we're comparing it to. And this is the important point, the standard, that we do agree that there is a standard. If there wasn't a standard, that we couldn't really have moral laws to go. We couldn't really have courts that could really have any way of judging a crime if there was no standard to go by. It just would be subjective. You go to judge, well, that's your opinion. That's whatever a jury's opinion. But another jury, another whatever, have different views. And if there is no definite standard, then it wouldn't really excuse any kind of behavior. And that's one of the things that we will be showing later, is just how ridiculous it will get and how chaotic it would get if there wasn't a standard. So that's kind of why we say that, at least from an evil point of view, it is clear that based on that standard, it's then the act through free will to choose to not do or act in accordance to those standards, but do something that is opposed to it. Why people do perform these acts, that's another question. But we do know they exist. We know that people are making choices. Now, here's the important point to this. It does mean that if, for example, one judge decided and was given the right to be the judge of the whole of mankind, this was the ultimate judge, and that judge put forward the rules of good and bad. This is what you can do, and this is what you cannot do. And we have a comment, so I'll have a look at that in a second. That if with those judgments, we would have to follow those judgments. So, of course, that means if you're not following those judgments, you're doing something that's opposite. That's what we're calling evil. And, of course, with free will, there's nothing stopping you having the ability to do almost anything. You know, you have the ability to destroy things, to kill people, whatever. You know, it's then down to the free will. And what the judge can do is then evaluate your life, evaluate what you did, and then pass judgment to say that if you are evil and you overall, the judge has decided, come to the conclusion that you're evil, they have every right, as the expression is, throw the book at that person. If the person's been that bad, you would never say, an atheist would ever say, or anyone would ever say, well, that person should get away with that. That person should be judged accordingly. Justice needs to be served. This is what God is doing. It's what in the Bible it talks about, is like when you were given time and chances to live the right life in accordance to God's standards, and that's the standard of the judge, is God's standards instead of the judge's standard. If you live according to those standards, God is going to look on you favorably, and what the Bible is offering is eternal life. And even in the Bible, it talks about how God makes a specific plan and purpose to deal with the good and bad of people, so that those who have made the wrong choices are judged accordingly, and justice simply needs to be served. We can't really look at it any more deeply in that, because that's really all anybody would comprehend. Justice needs to be served. God certainly is in the Bible talking about justice, and that's some of those difficult verses that we're going to be looking at, which explains why God made certain judgments, because it was a judgment call on those people at the time. So just quickly looking at a question here by 95792. If even one person suffers in hell eternally, how is it better than God's creating nothing at all if he was already glorious to begin with? Let's see if I can understand what he's saying here. If even one person... I really don't understand this. It's not a case of whether it's better. It's a case if God loves us as humans by creating us. So in other words, what he's saying is, what I'm saying, sorry, is that God shows his love, that he's created us so that we could have also the enjoyment of life. So we will be thankful that we have received that life, but it comes with conditions. The simple conditions, like I talked about justice, is if we are appreciative of being created, and by doing so demonstrate that by following the one that created us, being obedient to the one that created us based on his principles. It's not like a rigid bunch of laws and rules. We can live our own lives, have our own pleasures, but we have the guidelines that God is offering. You need to believe in him fundamentally and what he did in the world to save it, which is related to Christ. But other than that, it's about morals, about principles. And if we are in belief and demonstrating that through those morals, then God is going to offer us eternal life. What is the result of eternal, what we call hell, is those who do not, shall we say, qualify because of the life that they've led. But that's the consequences. That's no different than a judge putting an evil person in jail. But the judge wants to at least have people alive so that they can exist to enjoy life. If we simply wasn't here, then there wouldn't be life to be enjoyed in the first place. So we would want to be created so we have the opportunity to live a good life and enjoy it. And we can see that if we have a good life, it's very enjoyable. And we'll always be thankful that we have a life. I don't think anybody, including the person in the chat, would not disagree that we appreciate that we have a life rather than not. The only thing is, there has to be justice. There has to be a way of dealing with those that foul the grade, if you like. And God makes it clear what we need to do. It's not that difficult to comply with, as much as certain laws of the country is not that difficult to abide to if we're being honest with ourselves. But the problem is, what's our motives? We can get a bit selfish. We can get a bit independent. Think, well, I know better. I'm going to do. Who cares if God created me or not? I'm still going to go ahead and ignore everything, ignore all the evidence. I'm just going to live my own life, and I will deserve whatever I deserve. Fine, but you weren't the one who created you, so you are the one are just going to be the byproduct of what, and what should be the reason why you deserve to have that life in the first place. That's my point. If there is a God, God's out of his love created us. That's an evidence of love, if you like, because he's now allowing us to live our life, but with free will. Not that we fully understand it. We appreciate we've got free will. It does mean we have to make the right choice, and there are consequences on making the right choice and the wrong choice. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's basically why it is what it is. Yeah. Sometimes we can look too deep into these things to look at answers that just simply we can't provide. Maybe one day, if God is real, we meet God, he would explain more in detail why it is the way it is. But that's what we know in reality. And that's why we're saying it is better that we are at least created, because otherwise we wouldn't have the opportunity to have life in the first place. Right, back on. Evolution. Yes, so a lot of this was evolution is clearly factual. It's proven. Again, another load of nonsense. I'm sorry. Evolution is not fact. It's a theory. Thank you, 95792. Appreciate that. At least I tried. And he respected that. That's very good. Very, very good. Oh, Well, I don't know why, Mr. Murray, somebody's trying but can't seem to comment. Maybe it's under your settings, because people are commenting, or at least one person is, and we have comments every week. So there could be something your end with your YouTube. Maybe going to YouTube settings or something. I'm not sure why you can't. I'm just trying to think. I actually don't know why. I'll look into that later if you can't solve it for another time. So, not sure the reason. Even though I do work in IT, I actually don't know the answer to that. Anyway, back onto evolution. So evolution is just a theory. Now, this will be something I will cover separately one time in a week. That the theory of evolution, one of the issues is the difference between microevolution and macroevolution. Now, we would accept to some degree that macroevolution is demonstrable, because we can see the variations within a species adjusting over time, of a particular bird or finch or whatever it may be. Compare a finch, pictures of it 1,000 years ago to a picture of it now, whatever, you do see some variation, which you could say is some form of macroevolutionary process. The bit we don't see, we don't have any evidence of at all, is microevolution, where we see a transition fully from one species to another. I know the closest we've got to try and, or evolutionists have put together, is ape to man, of course. But as you all should know, of anybody that's looked into this, is there is that what we call missing gap. We don't see actual fully transition of an ape, then man, sort of thing, and there's every stage fully covered. There's like a gap. It's got so far as ape goes in terms of looking like man. And then I don't know if you know, when you ever watched, when I was in my history biology lesson or whatever, you have that picture of the ape and they've got all the variations. That's a drawn thing. Of course, these aren't all real pictures of actual apes and men, to try and make it show that it transitions. That was an artistic impression of what they expect the theory to prove, but they've never had all those examples to fully cover that transition, which means as much as how close, and I would admit apes are very close in many ways to humans, there is still a distinct, and I emphasize that word, distinct difference. Next one, which I thought was a little bit interesting, this I've been mentioning earlier, it was in the comments quite a bit. Something from nothing. Now, again, I will be honest. The more genuine atheist scientists agree that when we say nothing, we don't actually mean nothing, which is fine. I think that's a sensible answer, because we have no evidence whatsoever of anything coming from nothing. The moment scientists have something that comes about, they're looking for the something that came from, the cause, if you like. And that's what we have all the time. Wherever there's a beginning, we have a cause. And we have that time and time again. Now, the cause can be invisible, of course. Like we're saying, if the original cause of the universe was energy, well, energy is still something. It's not nothing. It can be even scientifically proven to some degree that it exists, because you can have various measures of tools that can measure the existence of energy. It can be read from certain devices that there is an energy that exists. There are certain, I don't think you can necessarily test all forms of energy. I wouldn't have a clue about that. But certainly energy generally can be tested to prove it exists. What it can't prove is exactly what is that energy? What is the makeup of that energy? What's its qualities and characteristics and attributes? So like I said at the very beginning, my point with all that is, how can we even comprehend an energy if it has no purpose, has no intelligence, and doesn't have, or at least maybe you could say it has the power, but the power needs to be controlled. It needs to be very divisive. It needs to be very precise, because The universe is very fine-tuned, very complex. It's not just thrown together. It is the most complex thing that we know of. And it works in the most wonderful way. Evidence upon evidence, even from science, always points to even further how incredible the universe is, even from the vastness of it, even to the most minute, as I said, single cell DNA level, even going to the absolute smallest micro level, it's still full of complexity. Why on earth can an atheist not at least agree that why something so complex, there's not a good case that the source must be intelligent? That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying it's God. I'm just saying it should at least be intelligent. So this is where we got to make those steps. Don't just go, no God, God. Let's go through the steps to see whether the case for God is valid. And that's my answer to those questions. I'm seeing if there's any more questions as asked. Well, I will go on to this one because it's going to be my next segue to the next section. That is about stealing, murder, whatever. It's in the Bible. Why is slavery bad and whatever you. And there's an interesting point. Since we do not know if any God exists, we cannot conclude the existence of morals requires a God. We cannot conclude. Well, it's true. We can't. But what's most likely? As I said, if the standard of morals has to be over and above what we see between one human and another, because we all have subjective views. When we do look at any morals, we happen to compare it without even knowing it sometimes, or we are comparing it to a standard. Just going to reply to somebody here. Thanks for joining, Anne. So that's really my point. Where is the source of that standard if it's not in humans? It's either that it evolves, and we're going to come to that to show why that's not really a good case. I'm saying it's not a case. It's a case. I think it's a case, but I just don't think it's a good one. And I think there's a better one out there, and I'm going to try and show you that. Now, let's get on to the tricky stuff now. I'm going to try and just, if I could just pause every so often so I can create some shorts from these things, because I'm trying to make some very clear-cut points here that, hopefully remove any kind of ambiguity. And hopefully answering some of these questions, because and that was just a very small list of, as I say, there was over 100 comments. I was absolutely flooded with all sorts of, and of course a lot of comments were very absurd. They were just people venting their anger because they just don't believe there's a God. Well, that's not really a good way to go about it. We're intelligent people, we're sensible. Let's use our intelligence, our faculties of human behavior. So I think, let me just double check something there. Okay, cool. Yeah. So, right. Hopefully that's clear. Let's see if we can use that approach. Use our intelligence, use our morals, use our respect, use our decency, and certainly use our brain to try and evaluate these things sensibly. And hopefully the comments will reflect that too. Now, there was actually quite a few. I don't know if I'll go for more. If not, I maybe just go through a few to begin with, and then if time doesn't permit, I don't want to spend too long on this. We'll do this in further weeks. So I promise I will address them all that has been raised. And if any that have been missed or you've got any new ones, I'm happy to address them as well. And I will accept this has not been easy. I do see that some verses that I didn't even realize when I haven't, I must admit I am somewhat suffering a little bit with memory loss as I'm getting a bit older now, that, things that I've read years ago, I just can't for the life of me remember them very well. So certainly a lot of these verses, I just can't remember the detail. So it's good anyway to at least refresh these points and go over them again, and at least give people a deserving reply. And you deserve a reply, because I'm not saying, I know some of you guys were a little bit aggressive and a little bit rude. I'm not going to hold too much against you for that. I'll just put it down to your frustration or whatever it is in life that's making you behave that way. But you at least deserve a response. So let me do that at least. Maybe that's part of your frustration. You've never had a decent response, and that yeah, I need to just send somebody a link here. See if I can do that. Give me 1 second here. I've just got to help somebody out. Bear with me. No. So you can jump on Restream, Murray, and maybe you can hear from there. But if you do, you'd have to close your YouTube down at the same time. You can't have them both open because you'll get some potential feedback. Alrighty, let's get back to where I was. I seem to have lost my page. Here we go. Right. First one I come to is Deuteronomy 20, verse 16. So this says, however, in the cities of nations of the Lord our God is given you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. So, of course, that looks like, as the suggestion is, some sort of mandate for genocide. And on the surface, I would agree. I didn't think you'd expect me to say that. I'm being honest there. That was a tough verse to read. But we need to get the context and understand precisely what's going on. So let's give you the context. Hey, Marie, I can see you on. Hopefully you can hear now. Do you want to just put a thumbs like that if you can hear? I don't know if I can see your thumb. If you stick it right up, I can see you. I don't know if you can still hear me. Can you do that or that? Whichever way. So it's up, yeah? Yeah, yeah. Anyway, okay, cool. Alrighty. Hopefully you can hear me okay. So, yeah, we're going through. If you did want to join, Murray, just put it in the comments. Then I can let you join. If not, you can just listen in the background. It's fine. Right. So, context. So, this was ancient Near Eastern. As mentioned previously, this record is during an era of where this whole thing about victory, significant victory was used. This killing the opposition was used. This type of speech was common. But as I said, this doesn't mean that is literally meaning wipe out. So that's my point here. It's basically textually stating the reason to just, in this case, was to stop the practice of child sacrifice in the temple, prostitution prevalent in Canaanite religion. It was framed as a judicial execution of a culture of not a racial cleansing. So this was really an act based, as I say, on this practice of child sacrifice. This was God, after giving the people warning upon warning that he's going to act and accordingly. So, of course, that will be his judgment. This is part of what we call justice, that if people are going to go against God in such a severe way, after warning, and through what they're doing, they're killing people, in this case babies and what have you, and going against God in such a severe way, there is ultimate judgment for that. And if that was in a court of law where somebody had been killing people, was gone on a killing spree, and they went to the front of the judge will say that person's sentence is a death sentence. You wouldn't question it. This is kind of something similar to that. It's God's judgment, death sentence to those people that were committing these heinous crimes, which included the killing of babies, amongst other things. Hope that explains that. Now, that doesn't mean that God is condoning just merciless killing. It's a just act of judgment, not a principle that he's agreeing or supporting murdering or killing people. There's a big difference. The law of retaliation. This is Leviticus 24, 17 to 20. It says, anyone who takes the life of a human is to be put to death, fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Remember, you know that expression, the eye for eye, tooth for tooth. That's where that came from. So this would suggest that God is kind of a vengeful God. I don't know, Murray, you've been coming in and out. I don't know if you've got connection issues, just to let you know. I'm getting little signs coming up to say you've joined and then you've not joined. I don't know if there's been some, that might be part of the issue, if you want to check your internet connection. So back to this one. Does that suggest that God is a vengeful God? So whenever you do wrong, I'm going to do wrong back for you, that kind of vengeful attitude. But this is to do with putting this into context here. The point with it is not that it was a vengeful thing, but it was the act of law. That the point being is that the law needed to be fair. It's all about a legal system. That if somebody does something this wrong, that's the payment for it. That way, somebody is not getting overly executed or receiving a punishment that's greater than the crime itself. So that's really the point of that. Is part of this legal system in making sure there is a limit of punishment that fits the crime. And that's really what the principle of what that verse is saying. Okay. Leviticus 25:44. Regulations on slavery. Now, before I start, I want to first explain what slavery is, because this is a misconception. There is something called good slavery and bad slavery. So let me explain what on earth I mean by that. Good slavery would be an example like in a war where the enemy, maybe one of the soldiers, young soldiers, say, for example, or maybe his wife from the village, local village, where they were killed by the opposing army. But that young wife of one of the soldiers of the enemy was then taken as captive. That's a form of slavery at the time, where that person is taken in and they are now under the enemy and they have to live under the enemy. And what the slavery was there was more like what we call a servant. And there were rules to this. That being that they would have to be looked after, they have to be fed, they have to be educated, etc., etc. And what has been seen is there are cases where those, what we call a so-called slave, ends up being more like somebody that under the circumstances, he's being looked after, and it's been a positive, respectful act to value the life of that person. Of course, this can be abused and has been, where we then see slavery where it's been abused, where people are taken, whether it's a captive or just taking somebody against their will and then abusing them in terms of how they treat them. So a slave can be somebody that can be well looked after, well treated, albeit a slave, because they're under the conditions they are. It is what it is. To the other end of the scale, where they are slaves that are really badly treated. And I would agree, just to draw a little fine line, that there is a line where drawn that says that this kind of category of slave is clearly not appropriate. No way God would ever approve of those type of slaves. But there is the slave in the context here, and looking at Leviticus uh, Leviticus 25, which I'll just read the verse very quickly. You male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. For them you may buy slaves. Now, the context, of course, with this is that these kind of buying and selling of slaves existed as a cultural lawful act. So at the time, this was something that was already in place within the culture of the time. So let me just give you a bit of background here. So it just says here, in a world without a bankruptcy court, social security or insurance or anything like that, slavery was often a voluntary entry into a household to pay off the debt or survive a famine. You see there again, slavery is something that can be, in a way, in certain circumstances, a good thing, because it was a better position than if they weren't coming under slavery. Like here, even in some cases, they are volunteered. They voluntarily offer themselves as slaves because it gives them some sort of security. The Bible was the first ancient code to mandate that slaves be given a day of rest. It's an important point, and the state that kidnapping a person to sell them is a capital offense. That's Exodus 21:16. So here, slavery is defined in the type of slavery where in certain contexts, God is supporting it because it's part of what principally is a good thing under the judicial laws that existed of the land at the time. But as long as, in other words, that person is treated appropriately, where in any way that person isn't treated appropriately, God is outlining that, saying, it's offense to kidnap a person or to sell them, because that was a capital offense. And there's also something about the day of rest, to give a slave a day of rest, which of course is a good thing. So even though, because a lot of slaves are like servants, if you want to think of it like a servant, they can be, of course, overused and being expected to do an awful lot of work for the owner and not having the opportunity to rest. So here's this is a mandate that God put into place, that you should have a slave to give it rest on the day of Sabbath. Part of what was the beliefs, religious beliefs at the time, to give rest for that slave. So it's a positive move in the principle, but that doesn't mean God is supporting, condoning slavery per se. It's a certain type of slavery. And now, back in those days, those certain types of slaves or certain categories were, with, you look at the context, a positive type, if you like, which is more like of a servant or a person that's taken in as a captive, where they're being looked after and given food, given education, and being helped, if you like, in some regard. So it is about the way that the owner, if you like, of that slave treats the person that's key, not the principle of slave. When a slave is being principally abused, that's what God clearly is against, not the principle of a slave if it's seen in a positive way, which back then they very much were many cases of that. Treatment of female captives. This is Deuteronomy 21, verses 11 to 13. I hope you guys, or people watching, or people in the comments, especially you atheists, are getting these points, because you do need to look at and do follow this up. Do your research. Look at the commentaries of these verses, and that will give you a lot of the background. And you can fact check lists as well, because this can be quite easily verified. 21 and said, Deuteronomy 21, 11 to 13 says, if you notice among you the captives are beautiful women that are attracted to her after you've mourned her father and mother a full month, then you may go to her and be her husband. So again, this is all a bit a tricky one. It seems to say to sort of facilitate the spoils of war in the treatment of women. So I'm going to read out this because this is a little bit complex one. So I'll just read out the context here. So in the 13th century BCE, female captives were usually raped and discarded or sold. This law forced the Israelite soldier to stop, bring her into his home, and give her a month of dignity and mourning. He could not use her. He had to marry her, giving her the full legal rights of an Israelite wife. Can you see how context is key? If later changed his mind, he could not sell her because he's of course married to her. She had to be set free as a liberated person. That's more the point, actually. It was a harm reduction law in a brutal era.